Hello everyone and welcome to Stephen King Month 2, the sequel to Stephen King Month that I started 2 years ago. And I probably should have done a whole series of reviews last year, but things were busy. So anyway, Stephen King Month is about talking about the new and the old and trying to discuss certain elements that you may not have noticed or even sometimes you do notice. And today we're going to be talking about a film that everyone is talking about right now, and that is It Chapter 2. It Chapter 2 is the return of director Andy Muschietti to the director's chair of the It duology, as I will call it, and follows the Losers Club 27 years later as adults. They are called back to Derry by Mike Hanlon, and a lot of hell breaks loose because of the clown that is still there. And there's a lot of things that are happening. That's all I can really say about the plot, because the plot's a little bit iffy here and there. Now, I want to say something real quick on the matter of this movie. I actually wrote out 3 pages of notes last night after seeing the movie. And they're situated by pros and cons, and within these pros and cons I have spoilers and even a trigger warning for content. So we're going to go through the pros and cons, the non-spoiler stuff. We're going to go through the spoiler stuff right now. And so when it comes time to actually discuss some of the spoilers that I have, I'll put up a warning. And then once we get to the whole content warning I have for this video, I will let you guys know. And if you don't want to know anything, I'll have a time selected that you can actually skip to if you do not want to discuss these topics. So let's get into the pros of this movie. I like the acting. The acting in this movie is really good. Most of the actors, including the actor who's playing the older Eddie, I think the older Eddie actor really nails it. Like, not only did I envision Jack Dylan Grazer growing up to being this type of actor, this actor in general, but the way he personifies the character of Eddie and makes it his own is also really good. A lot of people are bringing up Bill Hader as Richie, and yeah, it's definitely deserved. I really like what they did with Richie. Richie is still funny. He's the funniest character of the whole movie. But not only that, but there's this underlying story that happens with him that I personally enjoyed. It's a little bit of a twist up from what I knew from the miniseries with a certain other character, but we'll talk about that in the spoiler section. The cinematography is good. I really did enjoy most of the shots. There were some shots that were just kind of standard, but when it came to a lot of the transition shots that happened in the flashbacks, they were actually really good. I really enjoyed it. Although I wish there was some differentiation between the present and the past in this movie, because it did feel like they were all in the same room. And it just didn't make sense to me. There wasn't a lot of, like, huge changes that changed from, like, the present to the past, and then the past to the present, other than maybe a building's dilapidated or whatnot. The kills in this movie are so friggin' good. Like, I mean, granted, they're not, some of them are kind of the same, right? I mean, Pennywise will just chomp down on kids, and not to play it down or anything, but I really did enjoy the kills in this film, both of of Pennywise's variety and also of the deaths of the losers that happened in this movie, except for one, and we'll talk about that in the spoiler section. The film makes it all the more apparent that the film's theme is memories, right? Just memories in general. The entire time, the losers are either trying to remember the good memories or facing their darker ones. Especially their darker secrets. And there are a couple characters that have a couple of dark secrets. Most importantly, Bill who we'll get into in the spoiler section. And also Richie also has a darker secret, and we'll also get to that in the spoiler section. But yeah, the entire movie, the second act of the movie feels like they're gathering Infinity Stones, and you'll see what I mean, really, because like part of the plot involves them getting these tokens that have to be used for something, right? And the entire second act feels like an elongated sequence of each and every character getting an Infinity Stone. It made me think of Avengers Endgame. Like, this whole thing made me think of Avengers Endgame's plot, even though this was probably written way before Endgame came out. So, you know, it's a bit different. There are some fun nods and pieces of fan service, and yeah, there's a Stan Lee cameo in here, which at first I really liked, but the more I think about it, it was a little bit too long of a fan service. But it does pay some sort of credence to the fact that, you know, when you see a celebrity, people will jack up the price of something. You'll see what I mean if you go see the movie, which I do still recommend, right? Even though I will get to the cons, and there are some pretty bad cons here. The film adds some new scares that I found. There was some really funny, unique scares, although there was one that was like, yeah, you're kind of ripping off the Thing here. There's just a lot of really interesting scares. There's this really good sequence with the bleachers. The bleacher scene with the girl, I really enjoyed that sequence, mostly because it reminded me of how actually creepy Pennywise is as a character. And it doesn't really do a full-on jump scare where you think it's going to do a jump scare, but it's a really good sequence, and I felt it was well warranted. Now, one of the main complaints I see a lot about this film is that the film's not scary because the shift in perspective to adults makes some of the scares feel unrealistic because some characters are still afraid of germs. Well, I mean, when you grow up in an abusive household that pretty much puts you in a space of constant, you know, germophobic, you know, tendencies, you tend to grow up still with those tendencies. And I am referring to Eddie here. You know, and hell, I'm still afraid of spiders, and I'm a grown-ass man. And I say grown-ass man with a little bit of an asterisk, because I don't even know if I'm still grown. That's just me. But I should also add that the first film, It 2017, was about exploring childhood traumas and how they affect us as kids. And the whole thing about the book really is growing from traumas, right? How sometimes our traumas really transcend into our adulthood. So something like Beverly, and this is in the book, and this is also in the miniseries, so I'm not really spoiling anything here. But people like Beverly, you know, in the miniseries at least, and also in the movie, and also in the book, grows up and, you know, she's away from her father. Her father died, but she was still in a relationship with an asshole who kind of treats her mostly the same way as her dad. And that's part of the issues that some people have growing up, is that they'll have something that's missing from their childhood that really should not be replaced. And then they replace it with someone else that is not good for them, I guess. And in the case of Eddie, you know, in the book, or in the miniseries, he still lived with his mom, right? But in It Chapter 2, it's basically a woman that's kind of the same as his mom, so, you know. And basically, this movie is about recontextualizing childhood memories and looking at them from an adult lens, and there's a whole scene with Bill that pretty much emphasizes this, and it's partially during the final battle sequence. So that's a different story altogether. So that's all the pros that I really have about this film. Like, there's some other good stuff too, but we're gonna move on to cons here. So there is flashbacks in this film, and part of the journey of these characters is remembering a lot of things and trying to remember memories that are good for something that happens later in the film, and there's a lot of them. And this is kind of a double-edged sword, because I do think the flashbacks do add stuff to certain characters that recontextualize the characters for either the better or for worse, especially in Richie's case. But with the flashbacks in general, there were so many of them that it kind of got repetitive. And I think this is where people are really placing their blame with the pacing of the film. Because it happened so often in the second act really draws out. And there's a couple times where there is scenes of dead air when it comes to post-flashbacks, where some of the characters are interacting at the hotel, which, by the way, just feels deserted. And there's also another problem with this film, where the fact that, there's not a lot of extras, and so when it comes to the town of Derry, it just feels like a ghost town and not necessarily a town that has been lived in. So, I don't know, Warner Brothers is probably skimping on the, cast budget, but that's my thing, really. The first act of the film is kind of fine, but it moves by so fast that it for me anyway, it just makes me think that the filmmakers assumed that because the first film did so well that everyone knows who these characters are, and they don't have to do a lot of characterization of the Losers Club, in which half of the Losers Club doesn't really get a lot of characterization. The only people in the movie that do get more characterization is Bill and Richie, and that's about it. Not a lot of other characters get characterization in their adult form, right? Not a lot of other characters do that. So that's where the film kind of falls flat, is some of the adult characterizations as well. Not saying that the cast isn't bad because of it. I'm just saying, in terms of the writing, there could have been some better characterizations for some of the other cast members, so that's different. Anyway, the film utilizes some weird sort of methodology to recapture the 2017 versions of certain characters. So, if you look at Finn Wolfhard, for example, Finn looks so much different than he did in 2017. He pretty much went through puberty in 2 years. He grew taller, and his face grew longer. And so they had to do some digital de-aging on some of the characters in order to get across that these are the same actors and kids from the original, because they couldn't really film these scenes beforehand, which makes no sense. You probably could have shot this back to back and done it, but who knows. One of the things that they do with the digital de-aging, while it did work for certain things like Sam Jackson and Captain Marvel, I feel like here it just looked so out of place and it looked so fake. Like especially with Finn Wolfhard, his face pretty much looked like plastic most of the time, and it just didn't look right. It just didn't. And then they also do this thing with some voice work when they do the voices. They pretty much pitch shift some of the voices to make them try to sound like the 2017 versions to make it consistent. And I get it. I get why they were wanting to try to make it consistent with the original, because they wanted to make it seamless. But these two things really distract from some people. For some people, at least. For me, it kind of distracted me a little bit. Almost took me fully out of the film, if it wasn't for other things that happened. I do think, though, that there's a missed opportunity in both of these movies. Because Pennywise can use the power of illusion to fuck with his prey, I do think that it would have been very fucked up if in the first movie, Bill actually kills Georgie, right? At the beginning, not at the beginning, but when they're actually confronting Pennywise. It's not Pennywise dressed up as his brother, I think it would have been fucked up if Pennywise confused Bill to shoot his own brother. And that would have led to a deeper guilt in the sequel. So, I don't know. Maybe my idea is way too dark, but I think it would have been more interesting. So, that is pretty much where the pros and cons for the spoiler-free section are done. So, we are going to go into the pros and cons spoiler section. So, if you do not want to view this section, go to this timestamp here. Go to this part in the timeline. So, yeah, let's talk about it. So, going off of the pros, there's only really one that's a spoiler, and that is, the book had this ritual of Chud, and personally, I wasn't a fan of it. I wasn't a fan of this whole ritual of Chud bullshit, because you have this alien, and it's being influenced by supernatural stuff that Native Americans used, and I'm glad that they changed it up in the film to where Pennywise says, there's a lot of bullshit, right? This ritual would have killed pretty much anyone that did it, right? So it's definitely a change from the book, and I'm not entirely sure how fans will react to it, but I definitely enjoyed it a lot better than a lot of other people did. Now, when it comes to the cons, there's like three things. The first thing is that Pennywise does have his spider form, and while it is interesting and while it is visually impressive that they could do something like this, it just felt weird, because it's not necessarily the fact that Pennywise is full spider, because he never goes full spider. The bottom half of Pennywise is spider legs and, just all this stuff. But the top half is Bill Skarsgård, and I guess they didn't want to waste the talent of Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, so they made a compromise and said, okay, you're just going to be kind of like a crustacean centaur, but is giant. So that's pretty much it. It just felt like the effects for it was just a little bit too weird. For like, just not weird, but like it almost took me out. So part of the nods in this film for fan service involves, Bill Denbrough at the start of the film. So both in a book and a miniseries, Bill Denbrough is a writer whose work is being adapted for a movie. It's consistent with all the other different incarnations. And while I did like the fact that it's being self-referential and the fact that it's being shot on the Warner Brothers lot, and there's, a director who says that the ending is shit and you need to change it, which is pretty much, how Stephen King probably felt with, like, Stanley Kubrick, and how, he made The Shining's ending a little bit different than the book, which is also funny because Warner Brothers made The Shining and yada yada yada. This whole entire thing of the Warner Brothers lot took me way out of the film, and I was just like, wow, I didn't know you were going to break the fourth wall so fast on this one. And the last thing, I got to issue a content warning up front about this last one. We're going to be discussing suicide. It's not necessarily the act of the suicide, but what the suicide represents in the movie. So trigger warning, we're talking about suicide, and it's going to be bad. So, both in the book and a miniseries, Stanley Uris dies because he kills himself because he can't bring himself to face it again, his past. He can't bring himself to go back to his past to, face the it, which is, depression or whatnot. These childhood memories that made him scared. That is part of the themes of the book as well as the movie, is facing your childhood traumas and coming to terms with them. And it's not necessarily the act of the suicide that got me riled up. It's the ending. The ending of this movie After the gang defeats it, right? They all go their separate ways, and Bill and all the other characters get a letter in the mail. And it's this letter that pretty much left a sour note on this otherwise enjoyable experience. Like, so basically, the film itself frames the suicide as a heroic moment. And I don't like this whatsoever. Part of the reason why suicide is so scary for a lot of people, especially in talking about it, is that for some people, when it comes to the topic of suicide, some people who have tried to commit suicide or express feelings of suicide think that they'll be doing the world a favor by eliminating themselves from the chessboard of life. And it's just sad. And they do this with Stanley Uris, because what Stanley conveys in his letter is that, oh yeah, I think I would just, delay the guys and pretty much ruin the entire thing, and, we probably all died at it because of me, so I took myself off the chessboard. And I'm like, wow, this is such a terrible note to leave off on. Like, you could have just left well enough alone with this movie and what they were doing with Stanley Uris. Like, yeah, Stanley Uris still dies in the movie because he kills himself, but it's not for the reasons that you think. And I understand that they were trying to do some sort of twist on that story, but frankly, it's the most dangerous thing you could ever do in this case, to pretty much say that this person did the right thing by doing it heroically. Like, even the music confirms this with some whimsical music that makes it sound like it's uplifting, but it's not. It's a dour note to end on, and it left a bad taste in my mouth, especially when thinking about it overnight. It is bad. I still stand by this whole thing about Stanley Uris thinking that he's a hero for doing this is still bad. Sure, you can make the argument that it is true to life, and I won't disagree with you. It's still true to life, but it's still bad, because again, it's just, I don't like it. It's not a good decision to put into your movie that some character thinks that they're doing the right thing by killing themselves like this. There's hero sacrifice, and then there's stupid sacrifice. Hero sacrifice is like Iron Man snapping his fingers in the Avengers Endgame. That's a hero sacrifice. Whereas Stanley Uris, that's not a hero sacrifice. That's essentially being suicidal because you don't want to confront your past. That's essentially it. And it just took me way out of the movie at the very end. It doesn't retroactively change my thoughts on all of the movie, but it's just this final note that I have a huge problem with. So, in conclusion for It Chapter 2, I was hyped for this film. And I probably shouldn't have been as hyped as I was, because there definitely was points that were disappointing. I do think that this film is ambitious. It's very ambitious with what it was trying to do in terms of plotting and character growth, character work, and whatnot. But when it comes to this movie, it feels mostly uneven. The second act of this whole movie just runs way too long. And there are parts of this movie that are either just bad on their own or even offensive, really. And I'm not talking about the LGBT stuff, by the way. Like, that stuff was, some of that was in the book, some of that is for film only, so don't at me with that. So what am I going to give It Chapter 2? Well, I'm going to give It Chapter 2 a C-. Thank you guys so much for watching my review of It Chapter 2, and next week I am going to be gone to Portland, Rose City Comic Con. So next week I do have a review prepared. Actually, in the next 2 weeks I have videos prepared for Stephen King month. So yeah, something more comic book related next week in terms of Stephen King. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Peace.